Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we look at pieces of headgear showing cultural pride worn by members of the Canadian military, a collection of medals and memorial crosses, and a medical glass. Gary looks at a medical glass used by Canadian Army medic Captain Harry Dunlop.
What we do is we keep the history alive. These men, boys, women, nurses, they gave their lives for us.
Gary looks at a memorial cross and medal collection that tells the story of World War I's impact.
I think it's important to bring these stories to the forefront, real stories about real people and why it matters. That old adage, we are doomed to repeat history if we don't understand history.
Gary looks at headgear worn by the North Nova Scotia Highlanders throughout World War II.
That was the last word he remembers saying to anybody in that tank. He woke up in a Dutch hospital, and he was the only survivor of that particular tank. My name is Earl King. Well, I brought in a Second World War motorbike helmet, accompanying goggles, a Glengarry, and then I brought in the Second World War type helmet as well that we used up until the early 60s.
Donning their distinctive Glengarry bonnets to represent their Scottish heritage, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders have brought courage and perseverance to Canadian war efforts since their formation in Amherst in 1936, though their roots can be traced back well into the 19th century. At the time of the Second World War, the North Novies, as they were called, included several regiments from Nova Scotia. In 1941, 1,000 of their infantry regiment had deployed to England, where they trained before making landfall on Juno Beach on June 6, 1944. D-Day, as it is now known, was the largest naval, air and land assault in warfare history. The North Novies' transition from rural life to crossfire on the French shorelines came with great rewards and high costs. Today they are remembered in Amherst's Nova Scotia Highlander Regimental Museum.
Earl, welcome to Militaria, and thank you for bringing in these wonderful artifacts. Could you take a moment and just tell us what these are and where you picked them up?
Thanks, Gary. Well, the first item that I'd seen over the years had been the Glengarrys that my dad wore in the North Nova Scotia Highlanders during the war. And then the goggles were the next thing I located in a barrack box my father had. But on D-Day and through all their training, this was the helmet they wore. And of course, we Canadians wore this helmet, one like this, from right through the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, and even into the early 1960s.
As you probably know, the Cumberland Highlanders, which was represented by this Glengarry here, in 1936 was amalgamated with some of the other local units in Colchester County, such as the Machine Gun Squadron that was up in Truro, and became the North Nova Scotia Highlanders Machine Gun. And as a machine gun battalion, they weren't necessarily infantry, but they supported infantry with machine guns that were used much like we would think artillery is used in indirect fire. When the war broke out, when they started reorganizing the local regiments, and well, regiments across the country for that matter, for example, the Halifax Rifles, who you said your father first joined, became a tank regiment. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders machine gun they realized that they didn't need as many support battalions as machine guns, so they were re-rolled into infantry. So they lost the machine gun designation and the cap badge changed again, although from a distance it looks exactly the same as just what the title says. They then went over to England, became part of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, trained for the invasion of Northwest Europe, were part of the invasion for D-Day, fought through there, and then fought through all Northwest Europe into Germany until the armistice. Do you know what he actually did in England, like what his role was?
They were sent out, given various duties, either to guide a convoy of vehicles. They were sent out a number of times to recover German airmen who had been captured by civilians. And they seemed to have the motorbike. In a lot of cases, the pictures of my dad, it's a Harley Davidson with the stick shift on the left side and a sidecar. He seemed to be carrying either an Enfield 38 or the Smith & Wesson. That seemed to be all they'd had. But I think these German pilots were rather happy to be captured by people who are going to treat them a little better than the British civilians who'd just been bombed.
Right. So do you think that this was a role that he had in the battalion in England, or was it sort of like a secondary duty that, okay, we need 3 drivers now, and who can go out and do the job?
Knowing my father, he probably volunteered for a lot of these things.
So Earl, could you tell us something about your father, what you remember about him?
Well, I think he was not only a father, but a very good mentor. And one of the things I can remember, which was after I finished high school and I was deciding on a career, and I planned on entering one of the armed forces. I had had my pilot's license the year after high school, that summer, and I was interested in flying, so I was looking at the Navy, the venture plan, and the officer candidate program, which I did choose. And I can recall my father saying to me, "Do you know, there's something I want you to remember. If you're going to go on in command, even at the lowest level, always remember, if things go well, you thank your soldiers. If it goes badly, you are the one that have to take the responsibility." And I think all through my avocation in the military, I always thought of that. And I think it imposed a question about leadership into me very early in my adulthood, about taking responsibilities.
So Earl, thank you so much for coming in and bringing these wonderful artifacts, but more importantly, the wonderful stories about your father and his service during the war. What are the plans for the artifacts?
I think my son, who actually is an aficionado of motorbikes and that, would do well in inheriting some of this. And he'll be retiring from the United Nations probably in about 5 years and moving back to Canada. So I'll probably save it for him.
So they'll remain in the family
Yes,
and to be enjoyed and to pass the stories on to the next generation.
I think that's the best, yeah.
Right. So thank you again so much for bringing these artifacts in and appearing on Militaria.
Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much, Gary.
My initial thoughts on the artifacts were that they were interesting for an infantry soldier, especially the motorcycle operator's helmet and that. And then, of course, that led into multiple interesting stories with Earl.
Coming up on Militaria.
This really is a story of family, tragedy, sadness, but also heart. My name is Shara Kingston. I'm the collections manager for the Army Museum. And I brought in the Blois Family Memorial Crosses.
Through orders, decorations, and medals, Canada maintains a complex system of military service recognition, honouring the immeasurable sacrifices and commendable efforts of its servicemen and women. All Canadian soldiers who have died directly or indirectly in relation to their service receive the Memorial Cross, often called the Silver Cross. It was instituted in 1919 and is presented to mothers of loved ones of the deceased. These medals are deeply personal and often passed through generations as a token of remembrance. While all military decorations are awarded on behalf of the Canadian head of state, the gratitude they represent, like that of the Memorial Cross, is shared by the entire nation.
So Shara, welcome to the Militaria. And could you tell us what you brought in today from the Army Museum?
Absolutely. So I brought in a medal grouping that belongs to Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Osborne Blois, a photograph of him with his son, as well as 2 memorial crosses and Blois' identification bracelet.
So Shara, this group here, Colonel Blois' medals. The first one was the Distinguished Service Order that he received for conspicuous gallantry in the field during the First World War. Because of his rank, the only gallantry medals that he could have received are the Distinguished Service Order and the Victoria Cross, as well as, and we'll get to it a couple of medals down, the Mention in Dispatches, which is also for conspicuous service. He then has the British War Medal from the First World War, the Inter-Allied Victory Medal from the First World War with the Mention in Dispatches. And I have to point this out, we received this medal group like this. The fourth medal on there is his wife's medal for her French class in high school in Halifax. So how did the museum acquire these items?
So interestingly enough, they've come in two different lots. They've come to us in 2 different years, but by the same person. So the person lives in New Hampshire, and the Blois family that we're speaking of, they ran out of their ancestry line, and the daughter, who never married and didn't have kids, she passed it to a family friend who is close with them, and that person who lives in New Hampshire really didn't know what to do with these items and sent them along to us in the mail. This first thing came through the mail. And then later this summer, he came up to do a little visit, and when he came, he brought the memorial crosses and the photograph.
So Shara, the interesting thing about this group, at least to me, is not so much the outstanding valor that Colonel Blois displayed while serving with the 25th Battalion, is the fact of the mother's story, I believe, his wife and, the mother to his son. And the photo there is during the First World War of him and his son. And the letters that he wrote, the letters that the mother wrote, and the connection altogether. I was wondering if you could delve into that a bit for us, please.
Absolutely. Yeah, this really is a story of family, tragedy, sadness, but also heart. So, as we said, Colonel Blois served in the First World War. This is him in his uniform with his young son, Kenneth, on his lap. So before he left to go serve with the 25th, he wrote a letter to Kenneth to be opened on his 16th birthday. Kenneth was just a babe. And he writes this letter, and it basically says, if something should happen to me, you will now be the man of the family. I need you to take care of your sisters and your mother. You have to protect them. You have to help them. This is your job. Now, Dad did come home. Dad came home. He had been gassed and he had been wounded at Vimy. So he came home physically broken. He died in 1926.
So with Lieutenant Colonel Blois and his gallantry in the First World War, I think it's interesting to look at that more than once he took over command of the 25th Battalion. And we believe that his mention in dispatch was for taking over command of the battalion during the attack on Vimy Ridge when the commanding officer was killed. But that was also the circumstances for his being awarded the Distinguished Service Order. It was, again, he was wounded, commanding officer was killed, he takes over command. So I believe that that's just a wonderful story on this man's leadership. I'm wounded, if you wanted to, you could just go, yeah, I'm wounded, sorry, this isn't my problem anymore. I'm going to go off. But that's not the way that a lot of people during that time thought. It was, I'm here, I'm serving the country, we have a mission to accomplish, and I'm going until I can't go any further. And, in more than one case, he did this. What are your plans to get these up to snuff? I look at the metal group and I see glue seeping through, and they don't look to be the best quality mount in the world. There must be things going through your mind. So what needs to happen to this to make it worthy of being on display?
Well, it is a quandary when we receive artifacts that came to you in a certain way and tell a story, like the French excellence medal of his wife. I mean, that is sort of part of the story as well. But yes, they've been glued down in a terrible way. And I think the heart of the story is putting those memorial crosses with the medals and the photo and kind of bringing the whole story together. So that is our first order of business, is to put these pieces together with the photograph and the memorial crosses and keep them together.
A medal mounter thinks they should be done.
Right. Yeah, we definitely want to do things in a way that is proper and honors the items themselves, the objects themselves. It's sad that they paid so much money to have them glued down, but yeah, as you say, there's definitely remediation that can happen.
So Shara, thank you once again for bringing this wonderful grouping in to Militaria, and hopefully we'll see the two groups reunited quite soon and on display in the museum so that the public can enjoy them.
Coming up on Militaria.
He was resting at battalion headquarters in the cellar, and the Germans started shelling the area and shelling the town. My name is Steve Brown. I'm a pharmaceutical buyer. Today I brought in a medical glass that belonged to Captain Harry Dunlop, who was a member of the 102nd Battalion Canadian Army Medical Corps in World War I.
The First World War lasted from 1914 to 1918. The scale of suffering from injuries and illnesses stemming from trench warfare was extraordinary, and may have been much worse were it not for the Herculean efforts of the Canadian Army Medical Corps. Established in 1904, the role of the CAMC was clear: keep Canadians alive. It was tremendously difficult, but through field ambulances, clearing stations, general and stationary hospitals, doctors and nurses brought hope to an otherwise hopeless situation. As threats of new weapons emerged, medical interventions had to adapt. Demand for treatment became so great that 50% of Canada's physicians travelled overseas between 1914 and 1918. Remarkably, almost 90% of those ministered to by medics survived.
Welcome to Militaria, Steve. And I was wondering if you could just take a moment and let us know what you brought in today for us.
Well, what I got today, it's a small item. It's a military glass that doctors would use in their field hospitals, dressing stations, to administer medicine to the wounded soldiers that were being brought in. Mainly this one, I believe, would be just for liquid, and it was carried by the doctor on his belt. And this particular glass belonged to Captain Harry Dunlop, and Harry was in the 102nd Battalion, CEF, in World War I.
And how do you know that the glass belonged to Captain Dunlop?
Well, when I purchased it, in the pouch itself, there was this little ticket. And on that ticket was a family member's name and information. And they'd actually written that this glass belonged to Captain Harry Dunlop, who served in the First World War, and he was wearing this on his uniform.
So Steve, can you tell me what you know of Harry Dunlop's life after he graduated from Queen's with his medical degree?
Well, after he graduated, he went down to New York, where he spent 2 years in medical training. And once he was finished there, he actually took a position at a hospital in Peru. So from 1908 until 1916, he was at the hospital in Peru. And in 1916 is when he decided he wanted to do his part. And he left Peru and returned to Ontario to join up and start his military training.
And from his service file, I've read, and as you say, 1916 is when he was tested into the Canadian Expeditionary Force as a doctor in the Canadian Army Medical Corps with the 4th Pioneer Battalion. So he was their medical officer that was assigned to them and went overseas with that battalion to England until it was broken up there. He was then sent to the Canadian Army Medical Corps depot. They went there, and then they were assigned where they're needed, and he was posted to the 7th General Hospital, which is the Dalhousie Hospital that was raised from the doctors and nurses in Dalhousie University here. So I thought that was interesting. So this all belongs to Captain Dunlop. So what's the connection with the photo and the medal here then?
Okay, so during the First World War, Harry was, in my opinion, doing the research on him. He wasn't your average physician, okay, because a lot of the physicians, they were needed to stay behind the lines and, you know, take care of the, you know, save the soldiers, perform operations. But it seems like from what I find is Harry was probably one of the first ones to look at doing like triage, meaning he would go in the field. He actually went into the battle with the soldiers. So I guess he figured the quicker he got to the wounded, the better chance they have of surviving. So when they went over the top, Harry went with them. Now I've never heard of that, and any other doctor, physician, you know, going into battle with his troops and taking care of them as they fell.
So, Steve, we discussed him being awarded the Military Cross. Unfortunately, it wasn't gazetted, which meant published until after he was killed. So let's talk about what happened that he was like. What were the circumstances around him being killed?
Well, it's sad on 2 points. The big one is the fact that he made it that far and he was killed. And the second part is when he was killed. Okay, so what happened was after an engagement, he was resting at battalion headquarters in the cellar. And the Germans started shelling the area and shelling the town. And then there was commotion upstairs. There was a stretcher bearer had come to the door looking for Captain Dunlop, saying that the Germans had shelled the village and there was wounded civilians.
And what village was this?
I believe it was Hanoi.
Yeah.
And so Harry, being who he was, grabbed his gear, and just as the stretcher bearer and Harry were getting ready to go, standing in the doorway, a German shell landed not far from them, and Harry was killed by a piece of shrapnel. And unfortunately, that happened the 2nd of November, 1918, 9 days before the end of the war.
So, Steve, thank you so much for bringing these artifacts in.
You're very welcome.
I realize that you're a collector and you enjoy the research aspect of this and enjoy finding these objects and discovering more about them. Do you have any plans for these artifacts?
Prior to COVID, I would get invited to speak at different historical societies around the Toronto area. I still want to continue to do that, and I would like to do that out here in Nova Scotia. So I would like to continue putting the objects out there, telling people who these men were, what they fought for, the conditions, and hopefully by the end of it, you don't just see a medical glass in a case here. Now this becomes a person, and that's what I want to do with these objects. I want to take them from being objects and turning them into a person, someone who you can look at, and now you see a face and not just a glass and a black case.
Well, again, thank you so much for bringing him in. It was very interesting to learn about Captain Dunlop.
Well, thanks for having me. This was great.
My final thoughts is like Steve was really trying to stress with this one. When you look at it, it's just glass. It's in this leather case that looks to me like it could have been a German ammunition case ammo pouch that he picked up and thought, oh, I can use this to keep this in there. And so what? But then you've got the name, and you've got, then you can research who he was, where he was, what he did, and all that sort of stuff. So then it becomes a person. And whenever we're going to assign a person to something, I think it makes it far more interesting, and the artifact comes alive.